Coming up on this week's show, the return of Turrican, kind of.
An iconic Sega arcade closes in Japan.
And we explore games that weren't with Frank Gaskin.
Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 240, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to our first show of September. I was just thinking, actually, normally around this time of year, we're all feeling a little bit worn out because we've just had a packed summer full of retro gaming events that we've normally been to all across Europe. And this year, obviously, with everything that's been going on, they were all cancelled. But actually, we did a little bit of a virtual gaming convention over the weekend, didn't we?
Yeah, so we usually go to Retro Spillmessen, which is now known as Retro Messe in Norway. And it's a really cool event. We've hosted talks there with the Rare crew and all of those guys. Well, they did this weekend awesome kind of Retro Messe live. And the idea behind that was that they were raising funds for next year's event because they haven't been able to do an event this year. They haven't been able to get ticket sales, So to ensure the kind of future of this event, and they've had loads of people on there. So they had John and Brenda Romero, they had Metal Jesus Rocks, Howard Scott Walshaw.
Us guys,
yeah.
David in that ring.
Yeah, David Brevik, Trip Hawkins, Ashens. So they've interviewed these guys all over the weekend, and those videos are going to be going up on their YouTube channel. But also, you can help donate by going to retrospillmessen.no/donate. And that will really help them next year, hopefully run an event, and hopefully we can get out to Norway again.
Yeah, I do think it's really important that, obviously there's been a lot of events and, a lot of museums and everything all across the world that are really struggling at the moment. Because, it's not cheap to keep these things going. And obviously, if they can't sell tickets and people can't go, this is a really good way to ensure that these events are going to be around in the future. So I think it is important that people do support them.
Yeah, and we had really good fun. I think they're going to start regularly doing these kind of talks with different guests and stuff virtually. So, there may be a lot more content coming out for you guys.
I did love it when we were in Norway, actually, the fact that I think we were walking back from a bar and it was still daylight. And that's a bit dangerous, actually, because it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I was, the night's only early. Yeah, it's 1 a.m. Time for bed.
I remember that. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to Norway last year, only because I went to Japan for my 30th birthday. And I remember Dan messaging me, and he was so drunk, and he was like, "It's 12:30 in the evening, and it's still light out, and I'm so drunk."
I was riding a bicycle, completely smashed on the road at 1 in the morning.
So it sounded absolutely amazing.
Yeah, so I love Norway anyway, and that event, I think, one of the friendliest we've ever been to. What a great crowd that was there when we went. So, yeah, definitely support that. I'll put a link to the donate page and all the videos in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, you did mention that you were in Japan.
I did.
While we're out in Norway. A bit of sad news out of Japan, actually, this week. I don't know if you visited this place. An iconic Sega arcade is closing down for good.
Yeah, so I did get the chance to go, which is absolutely amazing that I did go. So Ravi sent this one over to me this morning. So Sega Building 2 Arcade, which is in Akihabara, has closed down for good. It actually closed down on the 30th of August, so the couple of days ago at the point of us recording this. Sega haven't said why they've closed down, but it is actually, from what I understand, the oldest standing arcade in Japan. It's been there for 50 years or something crazy like that.
Wow.
Yeah, there's 5 Sega buildings in Akihabara.
Yeah, so it's in Akihabara, which is where me and my wife stayed, funny enough, which is like the retro game kind of like central of the world in Japan kind of thing. So
what a coincidence.
I know, funny that. So it's absolutely full of arcades, but it's got these 5 absolutely huge Sega arcades, but Sega Building 2 is like the big one and the one that's been there forever. But that to say, they haven't said why it's gone or why it's closed down, but speculation is apparently during the pandemic they tried to stay open and there was days where they had 0 customers apparently. So they had absolutely nobody going in because there was no tourism. And then obviously the Japanese government have encouraged people not to go to these kind of places as well because of COVID. So it's really sad to see that it's actually kind of affecting, Akihabara as well, which is kind of sad because of when I was there, it was kind of like, the only way I could describe it is kind of like Times Square in New York. It's really that busy and lit up. So you don't really think of these things. You kind of like live in your own bubble.
And we've always thought like the arcade scene's been really strong, and it has been. But, like they're saying at the moment, the tourists have dropped to virtually zero during the pandemic. And also lots of people have kind of started moving on to mobile platforms for gaming rather than arcades.
Yeah, it says in the article what Ravi sent over recently that mobile gaming has actually taken over as the number one source of gaming in Japan, whereas it was arcade still before, which is just incredible to think, because obviously in the UK and America, it's console gaming all the way, but it was arcade gaming and now it's mobile gaming for them. So that's probably got a big hand in it as well.
And there's this amazing photo of the Japanese staff all kind of outside bowing as people are taking photos and thanking the customers for their kind of time. It's a very Japanese image, that one is.
Yeah, 100%. Like the fact that they all look so thankful as well. Like, they're all just there bowing and stuff. It's really sad to see, really.
Yeah, and I imagine, like you said, if literally no one is visiting these venues at the moment, and looking at it, I mean, obviously you've been there, it looks like a pretty big place. Yeah. And I imagine, employing the staff there and keeping the lights on and just, the day-to-day cost of it must be pretty astronomical if they're not making any profit off it, even for a company, a worldwide company like Sega, who of course are not as big as they once were, but, still got a few quid in the bank, I imagine. But it does say here, I mean, like you said, then there is a few other arcades around there as well. I mean, from what you've told me, the arcade scene is still pretty strong in Japan?
Yeah, so obviously Akihabara is like the central hub, but every kind of town we went to, we stayed in Tokyo, but Tokyo is like a country in itself. We were getting trains and subways all around the place, but everywhere you went, there were still arcades everywhere. But Akihabara, it was like Starbucks. Like, it was literally like there'd be a restaurant, then a Starbucks, then an arcade. Like, on every street, there was like a huge arcade. And like you say, they are big. They're not just like one floor. They're like 10 floors, and you'd get to a floor and it would just be like, this is the fighting game floor. And there'll be 30 Tekken cabinets. So obviously not in Sega. It was all Virtual Fighter. But so, yeah, the arcade scene is still really big there. It's just sad to see, obviously due to a bloody pandemic, that, some of them are closing down.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed, it's not going to be too much longer until they can reopen and people can start going again. I mean, it's never really been a place that, it's kind of been front of mind for me to visit, but since I've heard your stories, I think, I'd really like it, to go and have a visit to Japan. I'm not sure whether my missus would want to stay in the retro gaming capital area, though. I might just have to, leave that detail out before we get there, maybe.
Well, luckily, my wife, she actually researched it all for me, and she was the one who was just like, this is where we go, these are the flights we get, these are the trains you get, which is just absolutely amazing. That she was just like, because she's not a retro gamer at all, or even much of a gamer, but she was just like, yeah, let's just do it kind of thing. And we had an amazing time. But it might have something to do with the fact that I took her to Disney World for her 30th birthday. So
there you go.
Swings around a bit.
Yeah. Something like that.
Now let's talk about the return of a legendary gaming franchise. Turrican is apparently back on the PlayStation 4 and the Switch, although this has not been getting a great reaction from what I've seen.
Yeah, it was weird because it was announced. I saw this Metro article where it was like, Turrican's coming back from the original developers, real kind of clickbaity hype train kind of stuff. And it turns out that they made an announcement, and the announcement was it was coming out for the Switch and the PlayStation 4. But it's a simple port. It's not like a remaster. It's not like anything done. It's just that coming out to new systems. But as well, they announced these collector's packs. Now, these collector's packs have been getting I'd say quite a bad reaction because the price is absolutely nuts on some of them.
I was literally about to say, like, I looked at the price, so it's €200, and I thought, wow. Okay, what do you get in that? And then it was just like the first thing it says is you just get a port. It's not a remaster or anything like that. It's a port of, do you get the 3 original Amiga Turricans? And then you get like
reprints.
Yeah, and then you get like the SNES and Sega versions of it, the Mega Drive version.
But and like, a load of crap as well. Like
yeah, but then it's literally
diorama,
just like,
figurine.
It's just like literally the fact that it's just like and a foil poster.
And
like, a keychain.
Yeah. It's a lot of money. Like, you would have thought you would want with that, like, when you get like these big box PC game like re-releases and you get like an acrylic see-through or glittery like cartridge or something for the Nintendo or something, for that kind of costume, like a statue or something.
Yeah.
Not a keychain and a foil poster.
But it's strictly limited games who are doing this, who kind of do these limited runs. And you know what? Like, they put them out there, they're expensive, but the Switch Ultra Pack is already sold out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it does show that.
Not fair enough.
It's expensive
What
for
do we
us,
know?
but people are buying it.
Well, we're wrong because I was going to say that's proved us wrong because of each pack was limited to 2,500 units, wasn't it? And they've already sold out then.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Okay, well, fair enough. Fair enough.
And I've seen stuff like in the past with Chris Hulsbeck where he's released like the Turrican Remix album, and that's been £150. Limited edition albums are like that. And there seems to be a lot of money kind of in Turrican and the Turrican collecting. I kind of get it, but, it still doesn't seem to be one that could get that amount of value in my personal view, but they're selling, so
I'm just going to say it. I've only played Turrican for the SNES and Mega Drive, and both times I've played it, I've been like, it's not as good as Contra. I'm just going to say it. I'm just going to say it.
We're going to get letters now, Joe.
See, I do love Turrican 2. It is one of my favourite shooters on the Amiga. I can always sit down and have a good blast with that. But I mean, looking at this pack as well, I mean, there's a making of documentary Blu-ray in here as well.
Okay.
Which I don't know if that was something that they've released in the past, that it's just kind of put in this bundle, or whether it's something they made exclusively. So, making a documentary is not a cheap thing to do. But I do get what you guys are saying. I mean, forking out 200 quid for a video game up front kind of does feel like a lot of money. I mean, obviously it's sold out, so it's doing all right. But I think generally the way that most people would approach this, or most companies, is by doing a Kickstarter for this kind of thing, isn't it? It just seems a different way of doing it, asking, for the money straight up front, I guess.
And it does just, if it was a new port that had like specific stuff for the Switch and it had like special stuff for the PS4, but it just seems like it's the original game kind of just shoved on those systems.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to pay 200 quid, you could get an Amiga off eBay. Download it for that kind of money, even today. Now, it's something that actually, when I read this story, I was quite pleased about, because I messed up. We had a few sunny days, here in the UK. It does happen occasionally. We get 1 or 2 days a year.
Yeah.
And of course, what do all us retro geeks do? Retro Brighting Day. Scott in the garden, let's make all of our yellow games consoles and computers white again. So I went out there with my Amiga 3000, which, was a wedding gift, actually, off you and our friend Marvin, which, amazing wedding present. And I put it out there. The computer came out really nice, but I made a bit of a mistake. Insofar as the keyboard, I put this cellophane over it with the B-Blonde solution, and it's kind of got this marbled effect. So it doesn't come out very nice, a keyboard. And obviously, if you look on eBay, I think for an Amiga 3000 keyboard, the cheapest I've seen was about £250 recently, just for the keyboard.
Oh, gosh.
So recently I've been thinking, wouldn't it just be easier to paint it? Because I've tried retro brighting it again, it hasn't made any difference. And actually now, someone has released Atari and Amiga coloured spray paints.
Yeah, this is such a smart idea. So Retro Hacks, which is a company based in Poland, they've actually colour matched the spray paint. Now, I think this is good for people that have messed up retro brighting like you, but also people that have got you have damaged sections on the case.
Yeah.
And then you could kind of fill it with a bit of filler. Well, if you were doing a really extreme case repair, this would be absolutely fantastic for it. So the colours at the moment, they've got Amiga 500 beige, C64 beige, Atari ST and STE grey as well. And this is great because a lot of the jobs I've seen done with paints previously have just been ones from Halfords, or kind of people attempting to colour match themselves, and they've never really got the original kind of colours going. Now, the problem with these are, at the moment, because of shipping restrictions, they're only available in Poland. But I guess if you know someone in Poland, you could probably get them sent to them and then sent out. And I'm sure they'll kind of be very popular and get sent out to the wider world in the future.
Do you think these are custom made, or are these just kind of things they've bought off the shelf and then, they put their own labels on them?
Maybe they've, but I think there might have been a bit of mixing, colour matching and stuff going in there. Or, they're going to be the most accurate to that colour compared to buying some bathroom paint or some, and you could use these on anything, I guess. You could do your bike, you could do your car in Amiga 500 beige, Dan.
I know you're going to make your Amiga 500 Atari ST grey, aren't you, Ravi? I know.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
You know that it is. I've actually been looking at, forums and stuff to try and get the exact colour match because I've been thinking of doing something like this. And people often disagree about, what the correct colour is. And they give all these codes and you look and it doesn't look quite right. But often I think I kind of forget what the original colour of the systems is like. When you did your computer club that we went to last month in Nottingham, there's a guy there who had an Amiga 600 case. And I was like, I don't remember it being that brilliantly white. But he's like, he'd never retro-brighted it. He'd never painted it. This was actually the original colour, but I think we get that used to seeing our consoles and computers like kind of yellowed or faded a bit that when you see the original colour again, it almost shocks you a bit, I think.
Yeah, totally. And I think, this is going to bring some life into stuff. I'm definitely going to get the C64 one because I left a joystick on my C64 and it melted a whole section of it. So I need to kind of fill that up and then give it a respray.
Now, let's talk about these 8-Bit Do. We've talked about them on the podcast before. They make really good controllers. And now you can get an arcade stick that I've got to say looks very cool, but also massively overshadows the Nintendo Switch. And it's kind of in that traditional NES style.
Yeah, so 8-Bit Do are doing this new controller, which to me literally just looks like a really good NES Advantage. But like you say, it really does kind of dwarf the Switch because it's like twice as wide and twice as deep as the Switch. But it's an arcade fighting stick, isn't it? Essentially, with like all the turbo buttons and the micro switches and all that kind of stuff. But what's really interesting about this is usually when you see these kind of like A-class kind of like top tier fighting sticks, for Street Fighter 5 and Street Fighter 4 and stuff like that, they're always like $200, $300, as expensive as a console. What I think's really good about this is it's only $90 on pre-order.
That's good. That's really good. And I was just looking here that they say it's Bluetooth, but if you're bothered about the latency, you can actually use a USB-C port.
Oh,
which
really?
is going to make it a lot faster. So, you won't have that latency over Bluetooth.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think the aesthetic of it as well, like it's got that classic kind of like Nintendo grey to it. With the big red buttons as well, and then the nice black joystick. And then what's quite cool about it is the kind of turbo buttons and stuff have kind of got the Super Nintendo colours, even though it's obviously not licensed by, it's not been made by Nintendo or anything like that. I think that's really cool that they've done it. But it's only out for pre-order at the moment. It's being shipped on October 20th, apparently.
And there's another thing they mentioned in this article here on VentureBeat too, that if you are like, proper arcade stick connoisseur, you can actually swap out the universal buttons on here for like proper arcade parts, like Sanwa, like expensive premium parts as well, and also there's a bat style stick and a ball style stick that you can get for it too. So I mean, it really can be tailored to your preference of arcade stick and controls.
That could probably work with the SNES Mini as well, or if you plugged it in via the USB.
I was about to say it says it's for the Switch and PC, but I bet you can use it for a lot more, like if you have a play with it and stuff. But I think that's really interesting about how you said you can switch out the baton, and for the joystick you can have the ball or the baton. So I reckon, when we go to the expos and stuff, we might start seeing a few of these knocking about, people using them for the competitions, because that's really cool that you can customize it to your needs.
Yeah, and I think for fighting games, I always prefer like a bat controller, just because they're a bit easier in the hand to do like fast movements on.
You say that, Dan, but whenever we play Soul Calibur and you're drunk and you're tearing your house apart looking for your Dreamcast arcade stick because you're better on it, it never helps you, mate.
Yeah, because you've been sitting there practicing for an hour while I'm playing it, that's why. That's my excuse and I'm sticking to it. Now, before we get into our chat this week, all about games that weren't with Frank Gaskin, this is going to be a really interesting chat. We'll talk more about that in a second. But speaking of physical media, Crash magazine is back now. For those outside the UK, Crash was a legendary Commodore 64 magazine back in the 80s. I mean, we've done entire episodes about Crash before. And this, of course, is Chris Wilkins. Now, he's actually been doing this on Patreon, and it's going to be released now as a quarterly magazine in A5 format. And apparently a lot of the original crew are involved in this as well.
Yeah, they're doing it a really interesting way. So it's Retro Fusion Books, and it's got Roger Keane and Oliver Frey's permission and the blessing of Future Publishing as well. So they're actually going out and releasing it. Now, they're doing it in a really cool way. It's basically quarterly, and it's going to come out as a physical magazine, but a PDF as well, and you can get it printed outside the UK. But they're doing it through Patreon, which I think is such a good idea for like magazine subscription. So you just subscribe as you would with Patreon, back it at different levels. So it's $3 a month, which is incredibly cheap for the PDF, $6.60 for the printed magazine, and $8.40 for the non-UK printed one.
It's 52 pages if you want to get the printed edition. A5 quarterly magazine, like you said, then converting the price, it works out about £4.25 plus VAT, which £4.25 for a magazine these days is, it's a lot cheaper than any that I buy in Asda or WH Smith.
Yeah, it's really reasonable, and I kind of think they've probably kept the price down because it is A5. Yeah. But that's still going to be loads of content with 52 pages.
I must admit, I do prefer A4 magazines, but I kind of guess why they're doing it. Because I remember, trying to get that content, especially if you've got, how many pages did they say? So that's 52 pages. So if you're half that, that's going to be quite a thin A4 magazine, I imagine.
And I guess with Patreon, they can find out the amount of people that are backing it, and they can kind of justify doing it. So who knows, maybe in the future, if this is popular and it continues to get a kind of following, then they might be able to go A4 in the future. Maybe even A5, A2. It's going to be huge.
And I did say then 52 pages, but that, I imagine, is 52 pages of content. So you imagine buying, a magazine back in, like, the early 90s.
52 pages of adverts.
Yeah. It might have seemed like it was 200 odd pages, but, yeah, more than half of that was often advertising. But I do think it's great when you see magazines from your childhood coming back again. I know Chris does stuff with Zap, the annuals and stuff he brings out. I'd love to see, like, official PlayStation magazine, the original one coming back out with some new demo discs or Super Play or Amiga format or Amiga Power, like special editions of them would be incredible, even if it was just one-offs, I think.
Yeah, I love this kind of magazine culture, and like, a lot of people miss that style of writing as well, and style of reviews and the kind of cheekiness that comes with these mags.
Yeah, so definitely worth a back on Patreon if you remember Crash Magazine. Of course, I'll link that up and everything else we talked about in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, in a moment, we are going to be talking about really interesting topic, actually, unreleased video games. Now, we're going to be joined by our guest this week, Frank Gaskin, who's just made a book. You may know his website, Games That Weren't. He started that back in 1999. So he's been studying this stuff for over 20 years now. And he's actually just released a book with Sam Dyer and the crew from Bitmap Books. It's called The Games That Weren't, and it's 80 games explored. I think this is actually the biggest book that Bitmap Books have released. It's over 640 pages worth of unreleased games with, some legends from the industry interviewed in here as well, and covering games from like the 1970s right up to the modern day. And I think there is always something about, especially when you finally get your hands on a game that you read about as a kid, maybe in a magazine you saw like a preview of it, or, even sometimes they would review unfinished games. And then you go into like, Electronics Boutique or your local game shop trying to get the release date, and then they'd always be like, it's coming next month. Eventually it wouldn't happen. And then when you finally do get to play games that you only kind of read about as a kid, it kind of feels like you've got a bit of a lost treasure on your hands, I think. There is something, a bit of a forbidden treasure about getting hold of an unreleased video game.
Yeah, I always love covering those stories of kind of lost games and, found stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's also something quite tragic about it as well, because you think, all these development teams who put the heart and soul into it, sometimes for years, and sometimes companies had like millions of pounds spent on these, and then at the last minute, the games got cancelled. So we're going to be exploring some of the most iconic games that weren't unreleased games with Frank Gaskin in a couple of minutes' time on the Retro Hour podcast. Before we do, let's just give a big thank you to our amazing supporters, people who've backed this podcast on Patreon and ensure that we've got a future, mean that we can keep bringing you a podcast out every single Friday. And of course, for backing us on Patreon, you will get a mention on a future episode in the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. Like this week, thank you to Hans Wolf,
Gav Sillett,
Alessandro,
Phil Bork,
and Chad Clark,
who all made donations into our Patreon. And if you'd like to do the same, we'd massively appreciate the support. It really means a lot to us, and you can find that right now. The links are on our website at theretrohour.com. Right then, time to talk games that weren't with this week's special guest. Frank Gaskin is next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. Now today, We're going to be talking about a topic that I think is one of the most interesting subjects, and somewhat it's got a bit of a tragic side to it as well, and always makes me feel a bit jealous because, often these games look incredible and you haven't had a chance to play them. Today we're going to be talking about unreleased games, or if you like, games that weren't, with the man behind the legendary website and this amazing new book that's been released through Bitmap Books. Let's welcome to the show Frank Gaskin. Welcome to the Retro Hour.
Hi, you're right. Thanks very much for having me.
No problem at all. Now, we're going to get into a bit more about your amazing website that's, just an incredible resource, all about unreleased games, and this new book that you've just released with Bitmap Books in just a moment. But getting back to the roots of games that weren't, I was reading that you actually started this project and came up with the idea back in the mid-90s.
So basically, when I was a kid, I used to read a magazine called Commodore Force that used to be Zap 64, and they had this particular article called That Was the Game That Wasn't. So it was just sort of covering games like The Great Guiana Sisters and Parasol Stars, various titles that never got released. And I was absolutely fascinated by it, especially the ones with the screenshots. And it just kind of grew from there, really. It kind of began being something that I wanted to kind of try and find some of those games myself. And it just kind of exploded from there, really, and sort of grew into this website over time.
Everybody's kind of got a game that they wished came out on the system, or that they were kind of building up hope for and saw screenshots of, and it was never released. Were there any titles that really kind of you were excited about?
The main one for me was probably Daffy Duck, which is one of the main games that we were searching for quite a number of years. And I remember it was reviewed in Zap 64, and it was a game by High Tech, who did quite a lot of the Hanna-Barbera games and Warner Brothers games. And this particular title was probably their highest scoring game that they did. And then I was looking in the shops for it, couldn't find it anywhere. And then suddenly, about a month or two later, they had a note saying that High Tech had gone under. So I remember being really gutted about that at the time. So I'd say that's probably the first one I really kind of was aware of.
Why do you think it's important to document unreleased games?
Well, I think it just seems such a shame that a lot of these developers have spent months, possibly even years, working on something so hard just for it to be kind of all chucked away for no reason. It seems a massive shame. There are some particular titles which they kind of crash and burn just because the company went bust. And there might be a really, really decent game sort of there to discover, one that might actually be very playable. So there's part of that, and also trying to share people's hard work. So it's kind of we get the opportunity to kind of celebrate it as well.
Well, you set the website up in 1999. How much interest was there? Were there people contacting you with extra details and stories about these games?
Yeah, it's quite surprising. When the website came about, it was mostly just sharing initial findings that I had found just from friends and contacts in the 64 scene. When we started putting stuff up on the web pages, we put titles like Deadlock and Armalite 2, just not actual downloads, but just information saying here's a game that was never released and we'd like to try and find it. And then the developers of those games just saw the pages and got in touch in that way. And the website suddenly opened up quite a lot of avenues. So we did get quite a few developers getting in touch from that point. And that would then lead for them getting in touch with other developers and sort of spreading the word. And it just kind of snowballed from that point on. And
imagine getting on the internet must have opened up a lot of research avenues to find out about games that maybe you weren't aware of before. What kind of some of the games that actually inspired you to start this website then? Was it kind of a stage of you just seeing more and more of them all the time?
It was mostly the games in the original article that inspired it. So at the start, the main thing was to try and track down those games, to actually try the ones where there was screenshots in particular, Great Guiana Sisters. The main thing was I just wanted to find them so I could actually see what they were like to play. There was that excitement of being able to play something that you're not meant to. So it kind of grew from there. So the website was a way of trying to showcase the things that I had found, but also to open up and try and look for other things that I'd also found on my travels. So other titles that were reviewed in the magazines at a time and which never surfaced, in the hope that for it being on the internet, more people would get to see it, and then people would hopefully get in touch maybe with a copy, or even the developers themselves get in touch as well.
You may have known about a few titles, but did you find when you were looking for stuff that you were finding more and more games?
Yeah, definitely. So, several different avenues would sort of open up different games or new games I've never heard about. So first of all, when you had the developers getting in touch with you about a game that you had on the website, they often would come back and say that they also worked on these other titles as well. So if they dug out their work discs, you wouldn't only just get the game you advertised on the site, but you'd also get a bunch of other stuff as well. But additionally, when I started ramping up the website and doing more research, it was mostly going through old magazines, gaming magazines like Zap and everything. And just trawling through those was a massive eye-opener, because there's just absolutely tons of stuff from the likes of Zap 64, preview screenshots and stuff, showcasing games or even advertising games that just never got released in the end. So, yeah, it just kind of... the more you do, the more you kind of uncover as you go along. So the more research or more magazines you go through, the more you find, and the more people you speak to, the more avenues it opens up. Because those developers that you're speaking to also know other people as well who worked on other unreleased games. So it kind of just keeps going from that point on, and you build up this kind of network of information. One example was we were chatting to a guy called Colin Porsche, who did Operation Wolf on the Commodore 64. And did a head over heels and stuff. And I just got talking to him because I was quite interested in those games because they're favourites growing up. And just by chance, he turned around and he said, "Oh yeah, I worked on a Rainbow Islands 2 game for Ocean that never got released." And I was thinking, hold on.
Wow.
And at the time, we were trying to find out about Parasol Stars, which got lost by Ocean. Apparently the discs were kind of lost in a burglary or something like that. And we found it was Colin that had done them. So just randomly, by looking somewhere else, would uncover this this long mystery that had been sort of running for about like 10 years or something ridiculous.
Do you find as well that, when you're talking to people that worked on these games, are some of them a little bit reluctant to kind of relive those projects and experiences that, essentially they wasted probably a large part of their life on?
Yeah, there is a bit of that, which is quite sad, really. You just get some people who got badly burned by the industry. So when they worked on a lot of projects which they didn't get paid for instance, and it was a particularly stressful time in their lives. So understandably, it's not something they really want to kind of look back on at all. Even the fond memories, they just kind of want to park that in the past, and you kind of just have to respect that, really. Sometimes I've known people in the industry who, given it some time, they've kind of mellowed a little bit and they've changed their mind later on. So, but if people don't want to talk about stuff, then you just have to let it go, really.
One thing we find doing the show as well is often you'll talk to someone who worked on a project and maybe, obviously a game that didn't come out, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I've got a copy of that up in the attic or something," not realising what a big deal it is to, guys like us. Do you find that sometimes that they're like, "Really, you're interested in that?"
Yeah, definitely. Some people just don't understand why people would get so excited about something that was unreleased compared to something they had released. So that they think they've got something in their attic which is maybe only like 20% complete. It's just like a test demo or something like that, and you've got this person on the other end getting really excited about them digging out this disc, and you do get some pretty bemused sort of responses to that. But yeah, it's hard to explain to people why it's quite nice to try and get them to back up that stuff.
Is it hard to get people to actually talk emotionally about them, because games like Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll pretty much took down Sensible and big companies, and there's a lot of kind of negative stuff associated with unreleased games, I guess.
It does occasionally. It depends on the person, really. I mean, for Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll, John Hare, he's had quite a few cancelled projects over the years, and quite surprisingly, he's really passionate about talking about those projects, even though, Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll did essentially take down Sensible Software. But you will get other people that, it is a really painful time for them because of the financial loss that they had. There was one person who worked on a particular game who was just so upset about the whole ordeal that they went through. They lost money and almost lost their house, that they, that was it. They just didn't want to talk about it at all. It was too painful for them. And yeah, there are quite a few stories like that, unfortunately.
And I guess if you're a big developer as well, you've probably got a bit of a thicker skin having done like hundreds of projects.
Yeah, I suspect that's maybe why John is quite open about talking about these projects, and he's quite open about the failures and very honest about them as well, about what went wrong and what he would do differently, which is good to see. But yeah, as I say, it depends really on the person that you're speaking to and what exactly they've gone through.
Well, obviously, Frank, you've been researching this stuff for over 2 decades now. I mean, have you spotted any kind of common themes or reasons that a game will not be released?
Yeah, I'd say it. Just thinking back, so towards the end, because the main focus we had initially on the site was for the Commodore 64, and looking at most of the games that we started to cover at the beginning, the main reason was simply either the company going bust or the company deciding to pull out of the Commodore 64 market. So that was quite common towards the end. There was quite a lot of games around about the 1993 era that were simply dropped because the market had gone. So I think that's maybe the common theme. But as you sort of go into later years, it can just be that sometimes the project's a bit overambitious. But they haven't kind of allocated enough resource or time or money. And I'd say that's the common theme. But it changes as the years go on, I'd say.
So people could have kind of been aiming for a user base, and then whilst they were developing that game, that user base disappeared or diminished.
Yeah, it was fairly common, especially towards the end of a machine's life. That you'd see that quite a bit. So any particular machine, if you look around about a time when it was struggling, and I mean, for example, like the Atari Jaguar, when it was really struggling, you can see like a whole list of titles just getting dropped, and that's because the platform was failing. So. And the companies either saw that themselves or Atari were dropping some of the games themselves because of they were in financial trouble and that kind of thing.
So have you helped any of these games become available to play by the community since starting the website? You know, maybe developers have actually got completed copies that you've helped them get it out there?
So yeah, especially on like the Commodore 64 side, there's been hundreds of games that we've sort of helped take developers' discs, we've preserved them, and then we've sort of tidied those games up and made them available. So some examples, the big ones, maybe Solar Jetman was a game where the developer sent us his final copy of the game. So we backed that up and we were able to release that onto the website. There was games such as Daffy Duck where we recovered all of the source code for the entire game, and then we had to get someone to work on that and piece all that together. And there's quite a few cases like that on the website overall. People sometimes even just come to us and they've backed up their own discs and their own ROMs, and they've kind of supplied them to us to put on the website as well. So there's quite a good mixture overall.
And what's that feeling like, you know, that when you get hold of these files and you know that you're kind of the first person to play this game outside of the development team?
It's really exciting, especially it has to, if it's particularly a game that you have an attachment to. So if it's one that you've seen growing up in the magazines and you had that anticipation building up to play it, then that makes it a heck of a lot more exciting compared to something that you never heard about before. I mean, that's still exciting, but if it's actually seeing a screenshot from a magazine come to life and you can actually move it around and hear the sounds for the first time, that is really exciting. Like, I remember when I first loaded up Solar Jetman, I knew that it had music by one of the Folin brothers. So seeing the game load up, the title screen appear, and then Jeff Folin's music playing was just put a massive smile on my face. It was really, really nice. And what makes it even more special is that the disc that we saved it from it may have been the last copy in existence as well. So that there's excitement, but a bit of nervous excitement as well, because you don't want to mess up backing that disc up or get it scratched or anything like that. You're trying to back it up so carefully, thinking it might be the last one or something as well.
Yeah, I guess that's really scary with stuff like bit rot around. You're just wondering how long is it going to be until we can't save some of these games, you know?
Yeah, well, I think it's a real problem. It's a real problem with things like bit rot. I get it on CDs even now, just like those CDs that are meant to be indestructible. You chuck coffee over and that, and they're all starting to sort of deteriorate. So yeah, it's quite a real problem, really.
Well, 20 years after creating the website, you've put the stories into a book. So tell us how this project started and how it was kind of turned into a book.
So basically, when I was going through this, I don't know if it's a midlife crisis or the verge of one, I'm not sure. because I work in the web basically, so I do a lot of websites and small coding projects, and they're generally things that you do, they last for a couple of years and they get chucked away. And part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to do and work something on something a bit more permanent. So the idea came up to do a book. And in addition to that, the website was also coming up for the 20th anniversary of how long I've been working on it. So it just kind of came together, really. I was chatting to my friend Vinny Mainolfi, who does the Free 64 fanzine, and I was kind of saying to him about it, about what should I do, what could I do? And he suggested about writing a book on the subject, and it just made complete sense. So I think we started kicking that off around about 2013.
And the book goes so in depth as well. I mean, looking through the pages you've got here, 644 pages, and, you know, kind of going as far back as the 1970s. And I found that era particularly interesting in the book. The fact that you're talking about, you know, games from the 70s, you know, so there's like gambling machines you're talking about there as well. What are some of the earliest examples that you talk about in the book?
Yeah, so the one you mentioned was blackjack. So that was kind of, that could have potentially have been the first ever proper blackjack gambling machine with a microprocessor, so that was particularly interesting. It might have put some people off at the start. I thought that's why I kind of joke at the beginning, not to ask for a refund as a legitimate reason why we're putting a gambling machine in as the first game. But some of the other ones, mostly Atari based, because Atari was one of the main sort of players at the time, and there was an interesting title called Oops, also by Cinematronics. That was kind of quite a funny one, really, because essentially you're controlling like a group of sperm on the screen. Yeah. You have to kind of fertilize an egg, and it's just such a bizarre story about this such a odd looking game. But what was interesting about that particular title was how it sort of evolved, and eventually it became the inspiration for what became Star Castle. So that was kind of a nice thing to kind of piece together and figure out as well. So yeah, there's quite a few in there, different examples, really. It's hard to kind of focus on the favourite. I say Oops was probably one of the favourite ones I enjoyed sort of covering back then.
Well, I love the story of Cannonball, and that was an Atari game that was considered too violent, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's so originally it was going to be an arcade game. So the arcade's what we show in the book, and basically Owen Rubin did these sound effects where I think he just got some wet cloths or something and threw them at the floor to make this really realistic splat sound. And Atari took one look at it and just said, no, we're definitely not using that. And that was it. They they just dropped it after that. But they still went ahead and did the VCS version in slightly different form. Obviously, probably because you didn't have the realistic sprites or sound effects. So.
Well, I mean, you know, it's not just games that you cover in the book as well. You also cover unreleased hardware. And one story I thought was particularly interesting was the Atari Game Brain. Tell us a bit about this then.
So the Atari Game Brain was it was being done around about the same time as the Atari 2600. So they had this machine where essentially they'd previously done Pong variants and a stunt cycle game, and the idea was to try and sort of compress everything into one piece of hardware that ran these different individual games. But the problem was that it was quite outdated at the time they did it. They were just about to release the 2600, which had individual games on individual cartridges, and then they just had this limited shelf life machine which only had about 7 games tops. So they kind of looked at it and looked at the VCS and just thought it didn't really make sense. So they just decided to scrap it. It was a bizarre decision, really, to even consider it. I think it was just at that time where it was overlapping with the VCS coming out. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but an interesting piece of history. A couple of them have actually sneaked out, and a few museums have them, which is quite nice to see, though.
Well, one famous system that was cancelled was the Conix multi-system that I remember, you know, reading about as a kid and being really hyped for. And in the book, I mean, you've got some great pictures in there as well of, like, you know, Jeff Minter, who was working on games on the Conix as well. You know, pictures I'd never seen before. I mean, that's quite an interesting story. And how did you actually speak to Jeff quite a bit about that then when you were writing that section?
Yeah, so he's quite a tough one to sort of tie down a bit as well. He because he's quite a busy man. So trying to get hold of him by email is difficult. But Jeff goes along to the Play Retro events quite a lot. Usually has a stand at them. So I just kind of collared him at one of those with a dictaphone and with a list of questions. And he's really, really, really helpful, and just kind of went in great detail about a lot of what happened back then and what the process was for him. So yeah, it was good to get his input on it. I think it's quite important for a lot of the write-ups to have the input of the people that worked on it. So yeah, Jeff was, he's really good to have a chat with, really.
Well, there's some games that you cover that failed testing. I mean, was that kind of a common theme that, games wouldn't get past the testing phase?
In the early days, it seemed like it. It's probably later on, it may have happened a little bit. So the ones where it failed testing is mostly in the 70s and sort of early 80s with the arcade games, because they had that testing process to see how popular a game would be in the public market. And often, if something did perform badly, they would drop it.
I know we interviewed Eugene Jarvis, and he was talking about the fact that Defender tested really badly when they, put that in the arcades for people to try out. So it all seemed like, the fact that was a make or break thing for a lot of games. Like, we probably missed out on a lot of great games because of that limited audience that just didn't get it.
Yeah, I think so. There's always a case like that. Some of the games, like mini golf, for instance, is quite a nice little game for its time. It just, unfortunately, it might just be that you get the wrong people testing it at the time. So you might not get the right people seeing the game. So I think it is a real risk that you will have had games back then that were cancelled, which didn't really deserve to be. And other games that, of course, were picked and put out there just because the right people were there at the right time.
What were some of the most tragic stories you've heard when researching?
I'd say one of the more tragic titles that didn't get released for me was probably Solar Jetman. So that was going to be for a conversion of the NES game on like a number of platforms such as the 64, Spectrum, and Amiga and ST. And the game was essentially complete on all of the platforms. But what happened essentially was that the game bombed quite badly in the US. So there wasn't much. Suddenly, Storm, who were looking to sort of publish the game, sort of lost faith in it completely and decided not to release it. They thought it was going to bomb over here as well. And had they sort of kept faith and looked at the European figures, they would have seen that actually it was selling quite well over here. So they just completely scrapped an entire game for no real legitimate reason. It could have sold. I think it could have sold pretty well.
I mean, you mentioned before that you get, kind of prototypes of developers. I mean, is there any that you've got in your personal collection that are not available publicly and you have to keep to yourself?
So Green Lantern at the moment is, so I helped back this up as part of the book. So there's screenshots in the book showing this prototype for the first time. And unfortunately, because of the license attached to it, we're actually unable to release it at the moment. We're hopefully going to sort of negotiate and see if we can put something out, because it's only it's quite a short prototype. There's nothing much to it. So I couldn't see it doing much harm, but you have to be really careful with these things. So that's the main thing I'm really sitting on. Most of the stuff that I thankfully get hold of, we do manage to get to put on the website straight away, just with a caveat that if anyone's not happy, then we'll take it down, that kind of thing.
I guess often trying to find out who owns the rights to it can be difficult with all these companies, either having closed down or they've been acquired like numerous times over the last couple of decades.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot of the companies don't exist anymore, or they've been absorbed by numerous companies over the years. So sometimes most of the time, because the stuff we put up is so old and isn't really going to have any effect on anyone, we put everything up on the website just with a caveat to say that if they're not happy, then we'll take it down straight away and that kind of thing. But the thing is, if we don't preserve a lot of this stuff, then it's just going to disappear completely. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the media's rotting all the time, it's deteriorating all the time, and often I've had discs come through from developers, and a lot of those discs don't read anymore. You have to kind of do a lot of work to try and get something off them, and then they might not read ever again, and that's it. So if we don't do it, then this stuff's going to be lost. So,
well, was there a company with a particular track record for not releasing games? Like Atari seems mentioned quite a lot early on in the book, and also there's quite a few Amiga titles as well.
Yeah, so Atari had quite a lot of arcade machines that were cancelled. So that was one of the things I found as I was doing the book. I wasn't previously aware of it until I really started doing some digging. From my experience on the 64 side, when I was covering that, and from Ocean Software in particular seemed to have a lot of titles which got canned at various stages, especially towards the end, actually. So they worked on quite a few titles before they got taken over by Infogrames, and they seem to have a lot of titles in development hell. Things like Lobo, and various others as well. Even Green Lantern was in development hell for quite a while. So, yeah, System 3, I think, have had quite a few titles cancelled. They've had Last Ninja sort of dragging on for the modern day platforms numerous times. They've always made an announcement about a new Last Ninja, and then that never seems to turn up at all. That kind of dies a death as well. So
It was interesting to see about Constructor as well, because that title came out later on the PC, but it really seemed like it was kind of fit for the earlier systems.
yeah, so it was that was originally started on the Amiga. So it was only about a month ago, I think, we found some screenshots in the magazine, sort of showing it off on the Amiga. So we just put them up on the website, and it looks like a very different game back then. But it seems like they cancelled it in the early 90s, and there was quite a large gap till they sort of took it on and restarted it. But I think System 3 have done that quite a bit over the years.
I was going to say Putty Squad springs to mind. I mean, I remember, getting a demo of that, I think, on a magazine cover disc. And then, again, that's a success story, though, isn't it? A game that actually is now finally available to play thanks to the community who are interested in unreleased games. Yeah,
I mean, that was huge for the Amiga community. That was their holy grail. And I remember they were trying for years to get hold of the developers to release a source code or do something with it. And I think it was just a piece of luck, really, that they were doing this new release of the game, I think on PSP Vita, I can't quite remember. And there was, it might have been PlayStation 4, I think. And
yeah, PS4 it came out on.
That was it. So it was back in about 2013. And I don't know why they decided to do it, but I think System 3 said they had the source code and they were going to release it to the community for free, which is quite an unprecedented thing. It was massive. It really got the Amiga community excited, and there was a bit of trouble. They almost backtracked at first because I think they had trouble getting the data off the discs, and there was a bit of uproar. And thankfully, someone come along and offered to do all the work of backing it up and preserving it and making it available. And then we had this wonderful Christmas where it was released, and I think that must have done them some really good PR, really.
Well, that was our friend Galahad, was famously, he was actually a pirate back in the day on the Amiga, and he was the guy that obviously helped System 3 release that. I mean, I guess, often the piracy scene does kind of help preserve this stuff, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. If it wasn't for the pirate scene and just for people backing up ROMs to play on their emulators, so many of us, when we started out with the emulators, we were backing up our own collections just so we could play stuff on our PC. If it wasn't for people like us doing this kind of thing, then you wouldn't be able to play a lot of this stuff now. A lot of it would be lost, and a lot of companies, I think, are reliant on that as well, because they do a lot of the retrospective game packs on modern day consoles, and I'm sure that some of the stuff that they release is thanks to some of the work that people have done.
So there were a few arcade titles like Snow Bros and Liquid Kids for the Amiga that were going to get released, but didn't end up getting released in the end. What happened there?
So I think what happened for one of those games, at least, Ocean France, they spent all the time doing the conversion work, and Ocean hadn't actually got the license to release it. So it seems like a complete waste of time, really, because I would have thought they'd try and get the license first before you try and attempt to do a conversion. But thankfully, the developers have kept hold of all their discs, and the Amiga community managed to convince them to release it. I think Snow Brothers, though, unfortunately, there's a Atari ST version out there, which would be really good to try and recover. That still hasn't been found just yet, but yeah, I think the Amiga's been quite blessed, really, with some really cool conversions that have been found, and Ocean France seems to be fantastic at doing them as well.
Yeah, talking about licensing games, I mean, I was really interested to read some of the stories in the book about, times when a license has been pulled, mid-development. Like there was a Terminator game on the NES that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, so the Terminator was essentially being done by Sunsoft, and it looked like they had the license, they all going and everything was good, but then suddenly it got revoked by them, and then essentially they had it turned into Journey to Silius, or released it as Rough World in Japan. So basically, I think what had happened was that the game didn't follow the film plot correctly due to cultural differences between Sunsoft Japan and the US. So they'd went ahead and done what they thought was going to be a decent Terminator game, and the film company wasn't happy at all. So that was it. But thankfully, they kind of just reworked it and come out with Journey to Silius, which wasn't too bad. It's quite a nice game, actually.
Are there any examples you can think of projects that were just too ambitious for the time or the technology that they were trying to get it made on?
I'd say Sonic Extreme is probably quite a good example because they were trying to test different engines out. So they were working on hardware that had quite a few bottlenecks. So they were trying to use different engines. They wanted to use the engine from Nights into Dreams as well, and they weren't allowed to use it in the end, which was a shame actually because I think it would have worked really well in that. Some other examples, there was a game called Black Hawk that we cover. So this was like a kind of almost, it was utilising the Fractal engine that LucasArts did, like on Rescue on Fractalus. They were reusing that engine to do sort of skyscrapers. So you fly around in a helicopter, and it's kind of a nice idea. But on the C64, because the processor chugs along a little bit compared to like the Z80, it couldn't quite do it at a decent speed. The frame rate was too choppy, and I mean that's kind of a common reason as well, as if the hardware, if it's trying to do a 3D game on old hardware, then often they would scrap it because the processors just cannot do the calculations fast enough. I'd say that's something that's fairly common. It's cropped up quite a bit over the years.
And you've got a section on, I mean, something that's been very on trend over the last year or so. I mean, Bandersnatch, you know, the games that were far too ambitious for the hardware they were designed on, actually needed extra hardware. I know you cover those, the Imagine games in there too.
Yeah, the Bandersnatch title was a really interesting story overall. Mainly that I think the game would have been possible. It's just, I think they just obviously overspent and just wasted all that money and went bankrupt before they could get anything out. I don't know. I think the price point for the game was far too high because the price of paying for the hardware, they were trying to sell it for something like £40 with all this stuff bundled in the box, which many people back then probably wouldn't have paid. So I think there was the other company, Microgen. They tried to do something very similar, like the Mega Games as well, and they did Shadow of the Unicorn with like a RAM expansion pack, and I think that ended up, the cost of producing all that would eventually sort of take them down as well. So it's like a lot of these companies back then had a lot of ambition, but the price of the RAM and the hardware upgrades was too much back then. So maybe that probably caused a lot of problems, because I think it became easier perhaps maybe when the SNES came out. They started to do a lot of custom chips, didn't they?
So what's the most controversial game that's been banned then for reasons of kind of being too extreme or too rude or violent?
I'd say, well, Thrill Kill in the book is probably one of the key examples of one that's been that got banned because of the violent content in that. So there was Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll. Essentially, when the publisher was taken over, it was like a Christian Belt publisher that took over, so they had no interest at all at publishing the game. They thought it was far too risque. So very early on during the 70s, so one of the games I mentioned called Oops, I think that would have that kind of got changed because of the controversy on it. So that game, because it had sperm on the screen, so a game in the 1970s with sperm floating around on the screen would probably get banned straight away. And I remember there was part of the story tells where these secretaries walk in and they see the game running on the screen and they sort of run out screaming, exclaiming that there's sperm on the TV screen. So when they saw that happen, they decided maybe this is not a very good subject for an arcade, because, you know, arcade's going to be full of kids. So a game with sperm, maybe we'll change that. So they changed it to spaceships or something like that. It's
interesting when you talked about Thrill Kill as well, because that was during the period that kind of gaming got a bit adult and a bit serious. And then other games later on, like Manhunt came out and then was kind of removed from the shelf. And if listeners don't know about Thrill Kill, it was kind of a mad fighting game where you're playing all sorts of different characters in a dungeon, and it was very violent.
Yeah, so I think it's just the people might produce stuff at the wrong time or be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it might just been the timing, really. So Thrill Kill maybe been done a couple of years later. There might have been something controversial already. It might also be to do with the publisher as well, if the publisher's willing to take a risk or not. So I think that was the issue with Thrill Kill, is that the publisher got cold feet. If it was with another publisher willing to take a risk, one of those publishers that know that the bad publicity would be good publicity, essentially to sell it more, that kind of thing, then they would have probably been fine. So I think it's just a case of being with the wrong publisher or the wrong person at the wrong time.
When have technical limitations of the actual media itself led to games being cancelled? Like Frogger 2.
So Frogger 2, the main issue with that was mainly it wasn't really the hardware as such. It was, well, I guess it is really. It's the cartridge cost really. So the price on, so when they did games on consoles, one of the big issues with, and which put a lot of publishers out of business or out of the market, was the fact they had to kind of contribute and pay up a certain amount of money up front to produce a certain amount of cartridges. And that was the case with Frogger 2, is that they had to contribute, they had to pay all of this money to get the cartridges done. It was just too much at the time, and I don't think they had much faith in the N64 at that point. So it made sense just to concentrate on the cheaper sort of PlayStation CD media.
Well, there's one thing I wanted to ask about that I hadn't actually heard about before, was another Mario game that was meant to be released on the Philips CDI. I mean, we all know about Hotel Mario and the Zelda games that came out, but there's meant to be another one, Wacky Worlds, and they've got a section in the book about that as well. I hadn't heard about this before, but that never saw the light of day.
No, it's quite an interesting title as well, because it looks very similar to Super Mario World on the SNES, same sort of style, and it's just literally down to the deal that Philips did with Nintendo to release a bunch of their games. So the CDI, I think he had like a Zelda game that was released on there, and I'm sure there's another one as well. I can't quite remember. But yeah, unfortunately, they didn't get to do too much. Basically, the personnel changed in the background, and most of the people who were working on it decided to leave and work for different companies. So that was the only real reason that it kind of ultimately got cancelled. It had everyone had stayed around, I think the game could have actually been released. So there could have been a proper Super Mario World game on the CDI, which is just bizarre.
Yeah, and it might have shifted a few more units as well than the other games they put out on there.
Yeah, maybe probably not a good showcase of the machine in terms of the hardware, but I mean, it would have been a really interesting curiosity. I know a lot of people were quite interested in the Zelda game that came out on it.
Well, I guess some of the screenshots aren't amazing that you get. How do you actually get them cleaned up and put in the book and really have a nice way of representing that game?
So screenshots are really difficult. So say for the double page spreads, you want to try and get a really nice visual image which looks quite nice and clean. There's space to put the text and everything like that. When taking the screenshots, when they're scaled up, they need to be kind of rescaled using, I think, the linear mode, just so you don't get distortion on the pixels. You essentially just get the pixels sort of stretched. You know, when you get the anti-aliasing, when you just do standard stretch and you expand it, that's kind of what you want to avoid. So you have to kind of do that with the images. But when I was taking screenshots for the book, I was just trying to take as many as I possibly could, and then kind of left that to Sam really to kind of pick some of the best ones to include, because he's more of the designer sort of graphic artist and has the eye for the page layout. So you'd literally just take hundreds and hundreds of screenshots for every game and just hope that one of them was going to be good enough. Thankfully, I think there was only a few games where, I think it was like for the PlayStation, I was trying to capture the games from an emulator and the quality wasn't quite there. So Sam had a contact who was able to he was like an expert at taking screenshots from all these different emulators, and very kindly, I think he did the Thrill Kill screenshot and did some proper high-res ones. And
you've also got artist impressions of some games, like, Bandersnatch, for example.
That was kind of like a fun element to the book originally. So the plan, one of the things that I knew is that we had a number of titles covered in the book, which we didn't have anything to show at all. So there was no design document, sketches, or anything like that. So I had the idea of maybe getting an artist to come in and either do sort of like a sketch, like a pencil sketch showing how the game may have looked, or to recreate a screenshot using the limitations of the platform at the time. So that's eventually the direction we went, and Trevor Story did an absolutely fantastic job of doing a lot of those screenshots. And then we had Craig Stevenson do the Last Ninja one for the Spectrum, and it was just like a fun addition for the book, so you have something to actually see and imagine how it could have looked. And that was all based on sort of the developer recollections. So all the recollections we pulled together, we gave them to the artists, and they would then go off and come up with what they felt was a visual interpretation of it. But the additional bonus that we had is that quite a few of the screens, so just thinking of an example, Death Watch on the Jaguar, we had a lot of grainy sort of video footage screens that were quite poor quality. So Trevor took these and kind of managed to recreate those. Bandersnatch, actually, the one you mentioned, was another key example. Trevor took some of the screens from the commercial breaks video where the screenshot of the game running on a TV at a slight angle, very blurry and low quality. He took that and did that repixel interpretation. So what you get is this really crisp image on the page that just pops out. And Sam had the idea of trying to do that for a number of the games, and I think it's made a massive difference to the quality.
Well, when you've been writing the book and the website as well, I mean, are there any kind of points in history where you see there's a lot of cancelled games? Like, for example, I imagine the video game crash in the 80s was probably a time when a lot of projects got cancelled. And then in the 90s, when everything kind of went 3D and the PlayStation was out, was there any kind of common eras that you spotted?
Yeah, so like you say, the crash of 1983 was quite a common reason for a lot of titles. So I think there's a couple in there in the book that were cancelled for that exact reason. So Dark Tower and the collapse of the Vectrex was all down to that, unfortunately, which is a massive shame. So during the 90s, yeah, you're completely right. Often we had so many platforms sort of coming and going during that era that would be a fairly common reason for seeing a lot of stuff canned, literally because the market had disappeared at that point. But it really does vary. There's so many different reasons for cancellations. It could just be down to if the company's doing proper management of their money and not being overly ambitious with what they're trying to produce, and if they're producing good quality games on a regular basis, that kind of thing. Other reasons I've seen as well is just people losing interest in the development. They kind of haven't got their heart set in it. They might be given a project which they're not particularly passionate about. So, for instance, they might be given a conversion of a game which they didn't really want to do in the first place. Maybe they wanted to convert another game. So their heart's not really set in it, and they struggle to produce it and kind of get bored, and they either leave the company, or if they do finish it, you end up getting something which is really poorly reviewed.
What's the process been like writing a book compared to doing the website then? I mean, was it, when you started this journey, has it been, like a much bigger process than you thought, or how have you found writing it into a book form?
It's been really interesting because originally when I started out, I was imagining sort of like just a small pocketbook, really, just with a couple of titles covered in brief, like maybe a page on each game or something like that, really simple. And as I started writing it, it just grew from. I just kept getting loads of information from developers, and there was quite detailed stories that had the potential to tell. So I decided just to go for it and try and tell as full a story as I can, get the developer input from as many different people as I can to try and tell the story. And basically what happened was that the write-ups I was doing was starting to grow quite a lot, so they're becoming several pages long. But I didn't really worry too much about it. I just kept on going. But the problem with doing that, and by keeping up that amount of research and trying to talk to different people, making sure you do that for every single game, it takes a very long time. So for at the beginning, most of my time was spent just emailing people questions or doing Skype interviews and that kind of thing, and just trying to capture as much information as I can so I could then do the write-ups. And that took quite a few years to get all that information together in the first place, and then you're trying to put it together. And I completely underestimated how long something like this would take. So there was times where I thought, am I ever actually going to finish this book? Am I ever going to get to the end? And yeah, it's so strange, like being here now and seeing it released, because it honestly didn't feel like I was going to get to that point.
Well, one thing that I noticed was, there was a lot of kind of 2D titles, and it started to go into that 3D period with stuff like the PlayStation. Was that a big catalyst for not releasing a lot of these titles?
Yeah, I think so. Again, Death Watch, that was a platformer game on the Atari Jaguar. So this was during an era where everyone was trying to push for 3D, and Death Watch was just a 2D platformer. The main pull with that was that all the artwork was painted and scanned in. It had a lot of color. It looked really, really good. But there was pressure because of the PlayStation, because of how impressive that was when it came out. Any 2D games that were in development, there was some pressure from developers for certain projects to say, can we turn this into 3D? And I remember someone who worked on Death Watch saying to me that Atari essentially turned around to him and said, right, we want Death Watch as a 3D game. And he just turned around and said, well, I'm sorry, but there's no magic 3D button that I can press to turn it into it. So it's going to be 2D, or that's it. So yeah, I think it did happen quite a bit, and certainly I've seen it during my sort of time setting the book up. And it's a shame, really, because 2D games, I think, was still perfectly valid at that point, and a lot of games probably got cancelled for that reason, which is a massive shame.
You know, because I think that era when the PlayStation came along, and obviously you went from floppy disks and cartridges to suddenly CD-ROMs that held like 600 to 700 megabytes, and everything had to be, texture map 3D. And we've had people on the show like, Mike Montgomery from Bitmap Brothers and John Hare, who you mentioned before, who said, with their small studios, who were used to having maybe 2 or 3 people working on an Amiga or a Mega Drive game, suddenly needed a massive team of people, and they just didn't have the resources to do it.
Yeah, it must have been a massive culture shock. It just did seem to change suddenly. There was that pressure to fill an entire CD. Just because they had the CD, they felt they had to fill it. Some companies, they just literally did a basic standard game and just put video, essentially, just to fill it, and audio to fill it up at the beginning, because they didn't know exactly what to do with it. But there was that transition phase, I think, when games were becoming bigger and the technology was becoming bigger, certainly with 3D stuff and more open world based games coming out. I think it just completely exploded at one point. I think that's why a lot of people actually got out of the industry as well, because it became less of a more... they kind of lost their individuality on a game. They just felt like a small part in a very big set of cogs, really, within a machine. And one of the stories I think I found over time is that a lot of people got out of the industry for that reason, because they lost that ability to make their own stuff and have their personal input into it.
Well, Frank, you've been covering this stuff for, more than 2 decades, and your passion for it, really comes through, and it's incredible that you've now made this into this really comprehensive book. And like everything Bitmap Books put out, it's beautifully made. I'm sure everyone's going to just love having this product, and it's a real ode to unreleased games as well. I mean, speaking personally, are there any kind of holy grails for you? Any games that you've kind of been after for maybe a couple of decades now, and you really want to, it's out there somewhere, but you still haven't managed to track it down yet?
I think people are going to get sick and tired of me going on about this game, but on the website you can read about this title called Murder by US Gold.
Right.
A Commodore 64 game. It was basically a Cluedo-based title. It was released on the Amiga and the ST and PC, I think, as well. And it was reviewed by Zap64 and various magazines on the 64, and just never turned up. It completely disappeared. The game was reviewed, but they didn't release it. And we don't fully know why. Trying to get an answer about why the game was never released is like blood out of a stone, really. Or, well, not really blood out of a stone. It's more that people just don't remember. I think a lot of production at US Gold was kind of like a bit of a sausage factory as such. Games come in and out, and there wasn't really much attachment to games compared to maybe like a company like Ocean. So when you question people who were production managers back then, they sort of remember the title, but they didn't know why it was cancelled, for instance. But that I'd say is our main big one that's remaining. Originally it was Daffy Duck, but we did manage to find that, thankfully. But Murder's like the last big one that I'm quite desperate to find. But I don't know. We've been looking for it for so long. We've tried so many different avenues that it is getting to a stage now where there's not many more avenues I can really check. It's kind of hoping that someone just randomly stumbles across the disc and says, here it is, and then away I go. But
so if anyone's got a copy in their attic, get in touch with Frank.
Yes, please. My hair might grow back, maybe.
Well, the games that weren't available on Bitmap Books now, I mean, you cover, such a big era. I mean, pretty much, from the inception of video games, 1975 to 2015, over 80 games in there as well. You've talked to legends in the industry, David Crane, Jeff Minter, Matthew Smith, Eugene Jarvis, and many more as well. And you and Sam have very generously given us a signed copy that we can give away on this week's show as well. So we'll put a link to that. And if you want to buy the book as well. Because, I mean, I mentioned before we started recording tonight that pretty much all of my Facebook timeline over the last, over the bank holiday weekend was just my friends raving about what an interesting book it is. So everyone needs to check it out. I'll put a link in our show notes. Frank, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. Thank you.